Medieval era was violent, and even though castles were built to protect its owners, everyone's land was subject to invasion. The buildings were not enough. Weapons were needed to help landowners protect what was rightfully theirs. During the Middle Ages, weapons were also used to hunt food, build things, and of course conquer the land. The advancements of these weapons were very important and have led to some technology we still use today. To illustrate some of these advances, I will take you through a story of one medieval soldier and his quest to protect his land and village. Sir Malone was spotted on top of the highest tower of Dover Castle, poised with his long bow drawn to shoot the double D's that have entered the drawbridge of the castle. 100 years prior, that shot from 200 yards away would not have been possible to make with the crossbow. The weapons used during battle in the medieval times varied for the type of battles that were fought and the location where those battles took place. The advancements of these weapons allowed the knights the ability to wound their opponents, despite a full suit of body armor. The longbow was made up of yew cut with heartwood on the inner side, and was over 6 feet in length and allowed the knight to shoot 6 arrows in a minute, while a person shooting a crossbow would only be able to shoot a single arrow in that same minute. The invention of the longbow allowed the knights the ability to take out more enemies in the first line of defense versus the short-range crossbow that was available years prior. The longbow would allow the knights to wound several soldiers in the front line of their opponent's army, while keeping a safe distance from the enemy. As Sir Malone stretched a 6-foot longbow that weighed 150 pounds back towards his right ear, his eyes were locked on the target. With a quick release of the 3-foot arrow, the arrow soared through the air, skimming the leaves on the tree as it reached the double D's that were on the drawbridge. The double D's fell off their horses and landed in the moat. Sir Malone then ran down the stairs from the highest tower of the Dover Castle to the drawbridge, where he then drew his sword and finished off the double D's as they tried to swim away. He hopped onto the double D's horses and rode into the town towards the other knights from his platoon. When he approached his fellow knights in the arena of Windsor Castle, they were preparing for battle against the army of darkness. The saddles on the horsebacks were high-backed saddles that allowed the knights to stay on top of the horses when fighting with their lances. The lance was a long, strong spear-like weapon that allowed the knights' ability to injure their opponents while riding their horses. Stirrups kept the knights' feet locked in the high-back saddle, providing stability for the knights as the horse galloped across the arena as they swung their swords side to side or launched their lances at the opponent. The army of darkness entered the arena. There were 35 of them in total, compared to the 55 armored knights of Sir Malone's platoon. Sir Malone's platoon was dressed in chainmail armor, which provided them the protection from being cut by the blades of the army of darkness. The army of darkness carried the flail, a jointed weapon that consisted of spikes or knobbed steel head that was jointed by a chain to a short wood handle. The trumpet rang, signaling the start of the battle. Sir Malone's horses charged forward toward an enemy of the army of darkness. As he drew his lance, he had to duck left to avoid a flail that was tossed in his direction. He launched his lance at the enemies, knocking him off from his horse. He thought to himself, 1 down, 34 more to go. As the rest of his fellow platoon members were swinging their swords, launching their lances, and knocking off enemies off their horses, the horses themselves were running wild through the arena. The arena was now filled with weapons, all over the floor, making it difficult to fight. Both teams retreated to their camps. Sir Malone gathered his troops and the untamed horses and brought them back with him. He was going to give the horses to other people in his village to help them get around. Once back at his village, he started training more troops to help him in the next battle. The next battle was to storm the barbarian king's castle. In this castle was money, jewelry, food, and clothes for the taking. All he must do is kill the barbarian king and his troops. The only problem was the barbarian king castle had a door that could only open from the inside. The only way in was to break in. Sir Malone created a new weapon specifically for this battle. It was called the siege engine. The new weapon, which he named the ballista, allowed Sir Malone and his fellow troops to break down the castle walls and storm the castle. It took them 5 days to build this massive weapon that used wood, string, and metal. When they were done constructing the ballista, they tested it out on a wall in their village to make sure it worked. All of the people in the village followed Sir Malone and his troops to the wall. Sir Malone commanded his troops to line up the engine with the target. He then shouted, "Charge!" and the troops pushed the ballista into the wall and demolished the hard brick wall. Everyone in the village was screaming with joy because he knew if this raid worked, they would never go hungry again. 3 days have gone by, and the troops were training harder than ever, making sure that they would win this battle. They were sharpening weapons, making armor, modifying their swords, and saying goodbye to their loved ones, because they knew this was going to be a good fight. The following night was the night of the raid. They spent the whole day marching through the forest and preparing themselves for this battle. They arrived at the castle a while later, hiding behind some trees, planning their attack. The castle was defended by archer towers, catapults, and barbed wire fencing. Sir Malone and his troops agreed that they would attack from the east side, where there was only one archer tower. They creeped through the trees, arriving at the east side of the tower. Sir Malone said to his troops, "Are you ready?" His troops nodded, and Sir Malone then shouted out, "Charge!" They charged the castle with the ballista and broke through the castle walls. The troops stormed the archer towers, taking their longbows and swords, firing arrow after arrow, penetrating the armor suits the barbarian troops were wearing, taking them out one by one. Once all the archer towers were down, then they ran down to the main level of the castle and continued to fight. On the main level, they realized half of Sir Malone's troops were gone, and most of the King Barbarian troops were still alive. The King's troops doubled Sir Malone's numbers, but that was not going to stop Sir Malone from fighting. He did not want to go home empty-handed. He gave his troops commands, and then they charged, without hesitation, at the King's troops. Sir Malone's troops put out a good fight, and came out victorious against the King's army. This would not have been possible had they not made the improvements in their weapons they used for this battle. Building the ballista was the first step in the 3 siege engines that ultimately became very popular in future battles during the medieval times. The catapult was basically a stone thrower, which allowed rocks to be piled up on an arm that resembled a spoon with wide sides to hold the rocks in, and a long rope to pull quickly when the arm was full. That would send rocks and stones flying at their target. The only drawback to the catapult design was that it would not allow adjustments to the distance of the shot, so you had to be the same distance from your target for every shot. The trebuchet was the largest of the siege engines to be constructed. It used the physical design elements of a catapult for leverage and force to launch the largest and most deadliest pile of stones toward their targets. Instead of having a rope to launch stones, it used a very heavy falling load of rocks to hurl the deadly pile of stones at its targets. Sir Malone's next step was to find the King Barbarian himself and destroy him. With very few troops left who were all extremely exhausted, Sir Malone and his troops searched the castle for the king. They found the king in the highest point of the castle, locked in behind a big metal door. Sir Malone ordered his troops to get the ballista and requested they bring it up to the highest point of the castle to hopefully break down the metal door, so they could capture King Barbarian. The exhausted troops carefully maneuvered the ballista through the halls of the castle and up the long flight of stairs to the highest point in the castle. where the king was hiding. The ballista could easily break through the brick, but was it strong enough to break through a metal door? Sir Malone and his troops loaded up the ballista and prepared to launch the stones and bolts at the door. Just before the launch, Sir Malone said a silent prayer to himself. He needed this to work, so that his people would benefit from the siege of the barbarian king's castle. He yelled the order, "Charge!" And as if time stood still, Sir Malone could hear the swoosh of the ballista's arms, as it sailed the stones and bolts with powerful force at the metal door. The hinges snapped, and with a loud crack the door fell inward to the room where the barbarian king was hiding. It was a small room, and the king was next to the door where it fell. The door fell on the king, killing him under the heavy weight of the metal structure. Sir Malone and his troops cheered with joy. Finally his village would not need to suffer any longer. They had conquered the barbarian king and had taken the control of his castle. If it were not for the advancement of the weapons Sir Malone and his troops had available for their use during their battles with the Army of Darkness and the battle at King Barbarian's castle, Sir Malone may not have been successful in his quest to provide food for his village.